This revenge story contains intense acts of retribution that may be excessive and could be disturbing to some viewers.
The front door clicked shut behind David, the sound of familiar rhythm in his quiet suburban life. He dropped his briefcase by the hall closet, the usual clutter of family life a comfortable backdrop. He glanced at the small pair of pink sneakers by the door, a reminder that Camila was already asleep upstairs. She'd been out like a light by 8 p.m., exhausted from her soccer practice. He made a mental note to check on her before bed, a habit he'd kept since she was a toddler. "Honey, I am home," he called, the words automatic. Silence. That wasn't like her. He headed towards the living room, a small frown creasing his forehead. Hazel was there, but she was on her phone, her back to him. He stopped at the entrance. "Hey," he said, his voice a little louder. She jumped, almost dropping the phone. "Oh, hey, didn't hear you come in." She quickly turned, her hand a little too fast as she slipped the phone onto the coffee table face down. He noticed her cheeks were a little flushed, a new shade. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice casual, but his gaze was sharp, assessing her. He could feel a small knot forming in his stomach. "Yeah, fine. Just finishing up a text." She gave him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. He tried to brush it off as something of his imagination. Maybe she was just tired. He thought about Camila, how she'd been asking why Mommy seemed distracted lately. He'd brushed it off then, telling her it was just work stress. Now he wasn't so sure. He moved to the couch and sat down. "Anything interesting?" he asked, watching her. "Not really," she replied a little too quickly. "Just a friend." She picked up the television remote, her fingers tapping it nervously. He leaned back, trying to relax. "What friend?" he asked, his tone nonchalant. "Just, you know someone from work," she answered vaguely. The phone on the table vibrated with a notification. She winced. David watched her. She ignored it. He said, "Who?" He watched her face carefully. She hesitated, her eyes darting everywhere but at him. It's nobody, really. I'll call them later." She picked up the phone and turned her back to him. David's mind was racing. He was getting a very bad feeling about this. He'd always thought they were open and honest with each other. He casually said, "You've been on your phone a lot lately. Anything new?" He tried to keep his voice casual. "No," she replied, her voice a little too high, pitched. "Just, catching up on things." She stood and moved to the kitchen. "I'll start dinner." He stared at the phone on the coffee table, his gaze drawn to it like a magnet. He waited a few moments, making small talk while she moved around the kitchen. It felt awkward and uncomfortable. When she was out of earshot, he picked it up. It was locked. He tried her birthday, a common code between them. It didn't work. He tried some other codes he knew. Nothing worked. This was odd. He put the phone back down as she re-entered the room, setting a glass of iced tea down on the coffee table. Over the next few days, the small unease grew into a persistent gnawing. She was different. Her routines had changed. She was on the phone more, always away from him. There were hushed phone calls he barely caught, and a new perfume he didn't recognize. Her excuses became vaguer, her smiles less frequent. He started digging. He subtly checked the phone bill, finding a number he didn't recognize, a number that called her multiple times a day. His heart started to pound in his chest as he investigated further. He opened her laptop when she was in the shower. The email was right there. An email from Patrick that wasn't about work. It was a love note. A digital declaration of an affair, raw and undeniable. He scrolled, his stomach churning, each line of text a hammer blow. The words blurred, but their message was clear. He stared at the screen, a mix of shock and anger washing over him. He felt a strange hollowness in his chest. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes for a moment. He closed the laptop, a cold calmness settling in. He'd suspected, but the confirmation was a different kind of pain. It was like a physical wound. He didn't scream, he didn't cry. He just sat there, a storm brewing inside him, masked by a quiet exterior. He got up from the chair and left the room. She came out of the shower, and he gave her a smile that she probably didn't notice was fake. He was not going to let this slide. David didn't confront Hazel. Not yet. He needed more. He needed to know everything. He acted like nothing had changed. The same routines, the same conversations, but inside, he was a coiled spring. He was cold, calculating, and focused. He compartmentalized his emotions. He felt a sense of dissociation, watching himself from afar. He started with Google, the most obvious route. He typed in Patrick, and quickly discovered it was a common name. It would be impossible to find him like this. He wasn't surprised. He knew this wouldn't be so easy. He found a private investigator through a contact he had from his old college days, a guy who moved in the periphery of law enforcement. The guy's name was Ray, and he operated out of a small, cluttered office in a strip mall. It smelled of old coffee and cigarette smoke. David sat across from Ray, a man with a face that looked like a roadmap of bad decisions. Ray listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, his eyes sharp and assessing. David gave a brief overview of the situation. He didn't mention his name. He kept it simple. "My wife's seeing someone. I need details on him." Ray leaned back, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "Details, huh? That's my specialty. Name?" "Patrick. I don't know his last name." "Yet," David said, his voice low and controlled. Ray chuckled. "Okay, I am gonna need more than just a first name, buddy. You gotta give me something." David handed Ray the phone number from the bill. "Try this." Ray took the piece of paper, his gaze focused. "This will help. It's gonna cost you." "How much?" David asked, his voice flat. $500 down, $500 when I deliver. No results, no refund. Is that clear?" Ray's voice was gravelly. "Clear." David slid a wad of cash across the table. "I'll be in touch." Ray's tone was curt and final. The next few days were a waiting game. David buried himself in work, keeping busy. He barely spoke to Hazel, treating her with a politeness that felt almost cruel. Camila noticed the tension, of course. Kids always did. She'd started asking more questions, her small face scrunched in confusion. "Why doesn't Mommy eat with us anymore?" David had no good answer, so he'd just ruffled her hair and promised her ice cream after school. It was an awkward dance, but it allowed David to remain calm while he waited for the results of Ray's investigation. Ray called him a week later, a single word over the phone. "Got him." David met Ray at a diner booth, the worn vinyl sticky under his arm. Ray slid a thin file across the table, his eyes betraying a hint of amusement. "Patrick Henderson. Not exactly a saint." David opened the file. It was a collection of short, brutal entries. Deaths, bad checks, a string of evictions, a couple of minor arrests. Ray had dug deep. "He's got a pattern of making bad decisions," Ray said with a chuckle. "He's the kind of guy who just leaves his problems to everyone else." "Perfect," David said, a thin smile forming on his lips. This was more than he had hoped for. "You are not looking for a settlement, are you?" Ray's voice held a warning tone. "No." David's voice was firm and final. David paid the remaining balance, the cash almost a formality. This was just the first piece. He needed a man who could operate outside the law, someone who could make problems disappear, someone like Tony. He reached out to his old college friend, a guy named Frank who was always rumored to be connected. They met in a crowded bar, Frank's eyes darting around the room. He spoke in hushed tones, a constant nervous energy about him. "I need someone who can handle certain things." David's tone was measured. Frank leaned in, his breath smelling faintly of cheap beer. "What kind of things?" "Problems. Financial. Personal." David gave him a hard stare. He wanted to convey to Frank that he was very serious. "You are talking about Tony." Frank looked around the bar before continuing. "You don't know Tony." "I've heard stories." Frank laughed. "Yeah, well, the stories don't even touch the half of it. But if you are serious..." He gave David a card with a number scribbled on it. "Don't say I sent you. Just say you heard his name mentioned." David called the number later that night, his voice calm and steady despite the pulse hammering in his ears. He made the call from the garage. The door closed to muffle his voice. Camila was asleep, her nightlight casting a soft glow under her bedroom door. He didn't want her to hear this. She didn't need to know what her father was becoming. A gruff voice answered. "Yeah? I heard your name mentioned." "Tony," David said. He left a beat of silence, waiting for a response. "Where'd you hear it?" Tony's voice was cold. "Doesn't matter. I have a job for you." David kept his voice flat and emotionless. "I don't take just any job." "What is it?" Tony's voice still had a hint of suspicion. "I need to ruin someone." David's voice was firm. Completely. There was... Tony didn't waste any time. He was a whirlwind of brutal efficiency. David had given him Patrick's information, and Tony went to work. It was a surgical demolition of Patrick's life. Quick and merciless. David watched from a distance, piecing together fragments of information, a whispered conversation with Ray, an anonymous text message, a news snippet about a business deal gone sour. It was all happening according to his plan. Patrick started getting calls, demanding money he didn't have. Threats became more specific and more frequent. He lost his job, his apartment. Everything was coming down around him. David knew that Patrick was spiraling into desperation, that he was cornered. David found a text message between Patrick and Hazel. Patrick was panicked and begging for money. David felt a strange satisfaction that his plan was working. David pretended to be the oblivious husband, going through the motions of daily life, but his thoughts were consumed with this plan. He knew that his revenge had only just begun. One evening, David overheard Hazel on the phone. She was whispering, her voice strained. "I'll get it to you, just hold on." She was talking to Patrick. She was giving him money. The same money she said she'd spent on family expenses. David felt something inside him snap. It was like a switch had been flicked. He had expected Hazel to crawl back to him when Patrick's life crashed. He didn't expect her to double down on the affair. He didn't expect her to finance it. This act of betrayal cut deeper than the affair itself. It was a direct defiance, a clear signal that she had made her choice. And she didn't choose him. She chose Patrick. The rage was white-hot, a burning sensation in his chest. He had thought he could compartmentalize this, but this new development broke the barrier. He had been focused on Patrick, but now he was shifting his focus to Hazel. She would pay for this too. He couldn't let her betray him like this. He didn't confront her. Not yet. He needed to see this through. He needed to watch Patrick and Hazel fall. He was patient, and he was going to savor this moment. Camila had started spending more time with him, clinging to his side like she sensed something was wrong. He didn't mind. She was the only good thing left in his life, the only thing keeping him grounded. He'd do anything to protect her, even if it meant becoming someone he didn't recognize. He doubled down on his work, creating the illusion of a man focused on his career. He was a phantom in his own home, a shadow moving through his life. He would make polite conversation with Hazel, ask about her day with a detached curiosity. David's contact at the bank, a nervous guy named Barry, called him one day. "I saw something that might interest you," Barry said, his voice hushed. "What's that?" David's voice was cold. "Your wife. She's been making large cash withdrawals, and they're not for our account." Barry's voice was filled with a kind of awkward curiosity. David knew it already, but hearing it from Barry made it concrete. Hazel wasn't just having an affair, she was funding it. She was betraying him on every level, and she was doing so without even an attempt to hide it from him. She didn't see him. She saw right through him. She probably thought he was a fool. He called Tony. "I need to accelerate things." Tony's voice was a low growl. "What do you mean?" "He needs to lose everything. Now, make him desperate. And I also need you to make sure no one finds him. Or her." There was a pause on the line, a moment of silence that was more chilling than any threat. "You got it." David hung up the phone, a cold satisfaction spreading through him. Patrick was about to hit rock bottom. He had a plan, and he was going to execute it. David watched as the news of Patrick's misfortunes spread. He was a ghost in the periphery of Patrick's misery, invisible, unheard, but always present. He was a puppet master pulling the strings, and he was just getting started. He had always been a good planner. He just didn't know what he was capable of. He poured himself a glass of scotch, the amber liquid swirling in the glass. He glanced at the photo on the mantel, Camila's first day of kindergarten, her gap-toothed smile beaming at the camera. Hazel was in the photo, too, her arm around their daughter. Back when things were simpler. Back when he thought they were happy. He had set the trap, and he was now going to watch them both fall into it. He knew this path was irreversible, but he didn't care. He was going to make them pay. Both of them. David chose his moment carefully. It was a Tuesday evening. The same routine dinner they'd had for years. Chicken, rice, and a wilted salad. Hazel picked at her food, her eyes distant. He knew she was thinking about Patrick. "We need to talk," David said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. Hazel looked up, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "About what?" "About the money." He didn't look away. He stared right into her eyes. Hazel's eyes widened. "What about it?" she asked, her voice a little higher than normal. "The missing money. The withdrawals you've been making." He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, his hands interlaced. He was calm and collected, but his eyes were cold. She tried to deny it, her voice rising. "What are you talking about? I haven't taken any money." "Don't lie to me, Hazel," David interrupted, his voice low. "I have proof. The bank statements." He slid copies of the statements across the table towards her. Her face paled as she scanned the papers, her facade crumbling. She tried to come up with an explanation, but nothing was coherent. He watched her, a cold satisfaction growing inside him. "You were giving it to him, weren't you?" he said, his voice barely a whisper. Hazel looked away, defeated. She knew he had her. "I needed to help him," she mumbled. She wasn't even looking at him. "Help him?" David's voice rose slightly, a hint of anger breaking through his icy exterior. "He's destroying our lives, and you are funding it." She looked up at him, Her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resentment. He needs me. And what about Camila? You don't care her anymore, do you? David said. His voice calm again, but the question was loaded. Hazel didn't answer. She didn't even look at him. I want a divorce, David said, his words cutting through the tense silence. Hazel just shrugged. Fine. She didn't seem to care. David's lawyer was a shark, a woman named Miss Sterling, who was known for her aggressive tactics. He'd chosen her specifically for that reason. He wanted this to be quick and decisive. He wasn't going to give Hazel anything. He sat in her office, the sunlight filtering through the blinds. I want full custody of Camila, David said, his voice firm. Miss Sterling, a woman with a sharp gaze, nodded. We'll make sure of it. Any chance she'll fight? She might try, David said, his voice devoid of emotion. But I doubt it. The divorce proceedings were swift and clinical. David presented his evidence, the bank statements, the phone records, everything he had gathered. Hazel barely put up a fight. She seemed defeated, almost relieved. The custody battle was just as swift. Miss Sterling was ruthless, painting Hazel as irresponsible and unstable, focusing on her recent behavior. David didn't say much. He just let Miss Sterling do her job. He knew this was a strategic move to get Camila away from Hazel's influence. Hazel didn't argue, didn't try to defend herself. It was as if she had already given up, her mind elsewhere, probably with Patrick. It was as if she wasn't even present in the room. This infuriated David more than her lying. She was choosing him over her family. The judge ruled in David's favor, awarding him full custody of Camila. The gavel slammed down, a finality that echoed in David's chest. He was free. He was not just free from Hazel, but he was also free to make the next move. He walked out of the courthouse, the sun feeling cold on his skin. He had won the legal battle, but he knew that the war was far from over. He knew what he had to do next. He had to make sure that Hazel paid for what she did. He called Tony. It's time to move to the next phase, he said. His voice was firm and cold. I was wondering when you'd call, Tony replied, a low chuckle in his voice. David walked to his car and knew that Hazel and Patrick were about to go to a place where they would never hurt him again. He was sure about it. Tony knew a place. A facility tucked away in the middle of nowhere. A place that didn't appear on any maps. It was supposed to be a rehabilitation center, but the rumors said otherwise, that people went in and they never came out. Tony had described it with a cold indifference. It's where problems go to disappear, he had said, and David understood completely. A year had passed since the divorce. Camila was growing, adjusting to their new life. David was a good father, but there was always a cold void inside him. He decided it was time to see his plan to its end. He reached out to Tony. I want to see them, he said, his voice firm. Tony didn't ask questions. He just provided the directions. The place was located in a remote area far from any major city. David drove for hours, the landscape becoming more desolate with each mile. The road narrowed and the trees grew taller. The air felt heavy and the sky was gray. The facility was a grim, decaying structure, a collection of low buildings surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire. It looked like a prison, a place where hope went to die. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional creak of metal. David parked his car at the front gate. A man with a shaved head and vacant eyes approached him. He didn't say anything, just stared at David with a chilling indifference. David stated his name, and the man nodded curtly and gestured for him to follow. He was led through a maze of dimly lit corridors, the smell of disinfectant heavy in the air. The place felt oppressive, and David could feel his pulse quicken slightly. He kept his composure, reminding himself of why he was here. He was brought to a small, dimly lit room. A man who looked like a warden sat at a small table. David handed him a piece of paper with their names on it. He didn't look up, but he nodded curtly. "They're in Sector C." The man then nodded to the shaved head man, and they exited the room. David's heart began to thump in his chest. This was the final step. He found Hazel first. She was in a small room, sitting on a cot, her gaze vacant. She was barely recognizable. Her hair was matted, her clothes dirty, her eyes hollow. She looked up when he entered, but didn't seem to register him. "Help me," she whispered, her voice raspy. David looked at her, and a flicker of something resembling pity crossed his face. Almost. He quickly quashed it. This was what she deserved. "Did you think you could get away with it?" he asked, his voice cold. Hazel just stared at him, her eyes unfocused. It was like looking at a ghost. "I know everything," David continued. "I planned everything." Hazel's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition finally appearing. She started to shake, her face contorted with fear. "What did you do to us?" she whispered. "I made you pay," David said, his voice firm. "For everything." He found Patrick in a different room, a dark, damp cell. Patrick was strapped to a metal table hooked up to machines. He looked like he had been through hell. His eyes were wide with terror, and he let out a weak moan when he saw David. David stood there, watching Patrick suffer, a grim satisfaction spreading through him. He had made sure that he suffered, that he went through hell. He returned to Hazel's room. She was rocking back and forth, muttering to herself. He moved closer to her, leaning into her face. He told her everything. How he had used Tony to ruin Patrick, how he had arranged for them to be brought here. He watched her face contort in horror. He told her that he had made sure that this would happen. She screamed, tears streaming down her face, begging him to let her go. "Please," she cried. "I'll do anything." David just watched her, his face impassive. "You should have thought of that before." Patrick died that night. David heard the news from one of the guards. A simple, "He's gone." That was it. Hazel, they said, had lost her mind. She was just sitting there, laughing like a maniac. David left. The image of Hazel's broken face burned into his mind. He had come to see them, to see the product of his plan. It was exactly how he thought it would be. David drove home, the landscape outside his car window blurry and indistinct. The visit to the facility had left a strange hollowness in his chest, a void that even his satisfaction couldn't fill. He had achieved his revenge, but it felt cold and empty. He tried to suppress his thoughts about Hazel. He walked into his house, the familiar warmth of his home a stark contrast to the cold, decaying facility he had just left. Camila was playing in the living room, her laughter a small bright spot in his otherwise dark world. He watched her for a moment, his heart swelling with a mix of love and guilt. He knew that what he had done was for her, but that it would not change things. "Hi, Daddy!" she exclaimed, running towards him and wrapping her arms around his legs. He picked her up and kissed her cheek. "Hey, sweetie, how was your day?" He forced a smile, trying to hide the darkness that was still lingering. "It was good. We learned about the stars at school today." Camila was full of enthusiasm, and David did his best to match it. He put her down gently and settled on the couch to listen to her excited chatter. It felt like a different life, a different world away from the shadows of the facility. He knew he needed to have a serious talk with Camila. He couldn't hide the truth from her forever. but he needed to do it carefully. He sat her down in front of him, his hands on her small shoulders. "Camila," he said, his voice gentle, here is something I need to tell you." Camila looked up at him, her eyes wide and innocent. "Mommy isn't coming back," David said, his voice as steady as he could make it. She's gone." He didn't give details, just a simple explanation. Camila didn't ask questions. She just nodded, her eyes filled with a childish understanding that was both heartbreaking and comforting. She seemed to accept it with a kind of quiet resignation. She didn't ask him what happened. She was too young to understand the complexity of the situation. He pulled her into a hug, his throat tightening, and he said, "I'll always be here for you." He knew that he had done the right thing. Hazel had chosen Patrick over them. She had betrayed him, betrayed their family. She had made her bed, and she was now paying the price. He watched Camila play with her dolls, her laughter echoing through the room. He knew he had to move on, to rebuild their lives. He had to create a safe space for her, a place where they could be happy. He had to be strong for her because he was the only parent she had now. Sometimes in the quiet moments the doubts would creep in. He'd wonder if he had gone too far, if he had become the monster he had always feared. But then he would remember the look on Hazel's face when she realized what he had done. He had wanted her to be destroyed, and she was. He could feel a kind of twisted satisfaction from it. He knew that he would never be proud of what he did, but he wasn't sorry either. He believed that some people didn't deserve forgiveness. Some people deserved exactly what they got. He had done what he needed to do to protect his family. He hoped that was enough. He watched Camila, the warmth of his love for her contrasting with the coldness of his actions. He had taken revenge, but he was left with emptiness, a lingering darkness that would never completely disappear. He knew that, and he would have to live with it. He wasn't a good man, not anymore, but he had done what he thought was right. He closed his eyes and sighed. His plan was complete.